All right, so hey everybody, I've got two videos going to happen here for you. On this one, we're going to focus in on the new monarchies in England and France, and then on the second one of these, we will take a look at what's going on over in Central Europe. But let's get to it. Okay, so I know we saw this slide of notes in class time, but I wanted to use it just as a way to kind of help set the stage because we'll see some of these characteristics show up in England and France. So a heads up here, you want to be looking a little bit about like just a general reduction of power in the nobility, be thinking about like the court system and the dispensation of justice, and then maybe pay attention to like how some of these monarchs are able to, well, get more control over the church in their countries. Okay, so as we zoom in on the situation in England with these new monarchies, probably the first place for me to start is just this little bit of a heads up. Between the 1350s and the early 1450s, England was involved in a long-term war with France. It's called the Hundred Years' War. The whole war lasted 116 years, generations kind of fighting back and forth. And when that war ended, for both England and France, there was an opportunity to kind of like zero back in and try to get their respective kingdoms built up and united. There's a problem in England, though. That problem is they're not really sure who the next monarch should be. There is a death, I mean, the deaths that happened to the monarchs during the Hundred Years' War. By the 1450s, there is not a clear line of succession. There's not a clear picture of of a son that is going to step up and become the next king of England. So what you have are two different branches of the same royal family that are getting into a conflict with each other. Those two families are referred to as the York and the Lancaster families, and over the course of like 30 years, they're going to kind of wage war against each other and against each other's allies and trying to figure out which branch of this royal family tree is going to kind of rule the day. If you're thinking that this kind of draws some questions into the great chain of being, and like if the monarch is supposed to be the closest to God, why are they killing each other over it? People in England at this time had the same sorts of questions. While the War of the Roses was going on over in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella were getting married, and they were pushing things forward towards, the Reconquista and Columbus exploration of the New World. But in England, by the 1480s, things are really kind of a mess. By the time you get to the end of the War of the Roses, the guy that takes over as the king is like King Henry VII, and he's going to be there for a good 20, 25 years or so. And what family is he from? He's not from either one of these families. He's actually like a distant cousin in the royal family, and so he is a member of the Tudor family. And so this begins what they call the Tudor dynasty in England. If that name sounds familiar, it's kind of considered to be one of the first great monarchies in British history. It's also a new monarchy over in England. It's fairly weak when you compare to what's going on in Spain, but it does have some of these same characteristics. When you think about like the powers of the nobles being stripped away, well, for 30 years, the nobles that were parts of the royal family or trying to ally themselves with parts of the royal family, they were killing each other. So the nobles just kind of naturally got weaker. Then Henry VII steps in. He wants to be sure that there's not going to be any other kind of challenge to his authority on the throne like was going on during the War of the Roses. So he institutes what he calls the Court of Star Chamber, which sounds something like really sci-fi, right? But this picture shows us kind of what was going on. It's like it is like just a kind of a courtroom setting, sort of. We'll talk about that in a second. But it's called the Star Chamber because up on the ceiling they had like little like engravings and crystals. So like when the light, when the sunlight shone in there, it kind of like twinkled like it was stars. But in general, if you were going to get called to the court of the Star Chamber, this meant two things. One is that the king was going to charge you with conspiracy against the king because he's trying to regain that central control for himself. And two, if you're going to be called into the court, you're going to be found guilty by the court. It's not like a jury trial. It is a trial that's being run by Henry and his supporters. So anybody that he saw as being a challenge to his position on the throne, well, they were going to be a target here. And this is his way of kind of like solidifying this entire new monarchy for himself. And I know this is kind of small scale in what he actually does, but England is kind of in a small scale spot right now. This is kind of like the Spanish dominance going on at this point, which is why Henry is interested in trying to marry his kids into the Spanish royal family. So Catherine of Aragon is she is at this point, I think she's a granddaughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Or maybe she's just a daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. It's like the monarchies and family trees. You don't need that kind of detail. I struggle with that kind of detail. But Henry's son Arthur is set to marry Catherine of Aragon. And this is going to create some sort of like English-Spanish super alliance, which would be really dominant over on the western side of Europe. But this alliance is going to have some problems. Arthur gets sick and dies, and so Catherine is now like engaged to somebody that's not really around anymore. But that's okay, since this is about a political alliance and not really about love. They just kind of sign off, and Catherine is now going to marry Arthur's brother, who is also named Henry, and we kind of refer to him historically as Henry VIII. Even if you don't think you know much about him, I know many of you have at least heard the name Henry VIII. And we kind of like name drop him in here, but he is going to be much more instrumental on the direction of English religion. And so we'll have to come back and visit him in Unit 2. Meanwhile, over in France, they are dealing with the end of the Hundred Years' War as well. So as our inset map kind of shows us, like France, you can kind of see the label here, but France is kind of like spread out among all these different territories with these different places and spots in between. This map is dated 1444. So by the end of the Hundred Years' War, it's kind of like France has got more control here. And one thing that makes France really French is this growing collective hatred of the English. It's a little bit of a national identity starting to come in here. This is going to let like King Louis the 11th. Sometimes he's called the Spider King because like the 8 legs of a spider, he just kind of is reaching out over France and gaining more and more territory. He is able to acquire or defeat in like battle like the kingdom of Burgundy. And so this is the spot over here on far eastern France. Burgundy is, I mean, it's kind of a money-making region because of the farmland that they've got. It's important to get in there. There's money there. And so this is trying to get power away from nobles in that area and try to draw some new alliances to what's going on with the Kingdom of France. The second step on this, so far as trying to unify some French power, this is going to be King Charles VIII, who in the 1480s and 1490s is going to kind of expand that French power over to Naples. If you remember where Naples is, that's southern Italy, and we'll talk about Italy in a separate spot on this topic. But Italy is kind of hurting in its political and military power, plenty of money, but they don't have the military power. They don't really have the same kind of unity that you're starting to see in France. And so, Italy's going to just, well, be conquered by, well, these Western European countries. France in the south, Spain a little bit more so towards the north. I don't know that I would call either Louis or Charles as like the new monarch that comes on this, but the first one that I can really say is is like a new monarchy is under Francis the First, or in French it would be Francois the First. In 1516, just after he takes over, he issues the Concordat of Bologna, which is an agreement, kind of an agreement that he makes with the Catholic Church that he is going to have control to be able to name bishops within the Kingdom of France. And so this is definitely a move that is going to reduce the power of the clergy and increase the power of the king, because in giving the king power to appoint bishops, you're basically giving the king like some pretty significant control in the church. If you're wondering why is the church okay with doing this, well, the pope that he's dealing with is Pope Leo X. We'll see him again in Unit 2 because Pope Leo X seems to make some church decisions based on not religious matters. It's a little bit more on the political and financial matters. And this makes political and financial sense for the church in this because France is a growing kingdom. And other thing to say about Pope Leo for right now is he's actually a member of the Medici family, but more on him in Unit 2. The last thing to kind of tell you on this is going to be that this is going to create what they call the Gallican Church in France. I'm just kind of pointing out this term for you because sometimes you'll see like the term Gallican Church. A good solid definition for this is it is the Catholic Church in France. That Catholic Church in France, which has got a little bit more control being held by, well, King Francois, and it's just really going to help establish France in the direction of being a new monarchy. Same with England, same with Spain, but Spain is definitely on the front edge of this because what they have with their overseas empire. All right, so in the next part of this, we'll take a look at a couple of monarchies that aren't new, not even really monarchies, and that's going to be the Holy Roman Empire and a revisit of the Italian city-states. So, thanks for hanging out.